Analyze linear functions lesson 9, day 1. Wilson Middle School has money left over from last year's fundraiser. This year, students are selling discount cards for local businesses. The graph shows the leftover money and the amount the school will earn for each card sold. Write an equation that shows the total amount of money the school will have, including the leftover money and the amount earned selling X number of cards. All right, so we have some very important information that we were given in this problem. So the first thing that we're given is that the school has money left over from last year's fundraiser. All right, they're selling these discount cards, and they also tell us that we need to figure out how much money the school will earn. We need to find the leftover money and the amount of money the school will earn for each card sold using the graph. That's over here, of course. So we need to write an equation that shows the total amount of money the school will have, including the leftover money and X number of cards. So our equation, which when we look at our graph, it's clearly a linear graph. It's a straight line. So that means we're going to use the slope-intercept formula for this. The slope-intercept formula is y equals mx plus b, where m is our slope, which we're calling slope now, but we used to call it our rate of change. And b is now called our y-intercept, which we used to call our initial value. Okay, so looking at our graph, we can tell that it starts at 100 because 100 is where the graph or the line crosses the y-axis. It starts at 100. Well, our y-intercept is actually going to represent the amount of money the school started with. So that's their leftover money. Whereas the slope is going to represent how much money they're charging per card. Cost per card. All right, then it says, well, A says, well, what does X represent? Well, in our original problem, they gave us that X is the number of cards. Okay, B says, what's the rate of change? And explain how you got your answer. Again, our rate of change is actually going to be now called the slope. So we find the slope how we found it before, where we find the change in y and divide it by the change in x. Now we're going to start calling it rise over run. How do we get from one point to the next? Well, from the starting point, our initial value, we go from 100 to 20. So we go up 20, or we rise 20. And we run from 0 to 10, 10, up 20, rise or run 10. So rise over run is our slope, which is our m, of course, and then 20 divided by 10 is 2. So our rate of change is 2 because rate of change is the same thing as rise over run, and our rise from one point to the next was 20. While to get from one point to the next, we will run over or go over 10 units. So our rate of change is actually 2. And what does it represent? Again, we said our rate of change is our slope, which is going to be the amount of money we're charging per card. So since we're talking about money, then it's going to represent $2 per card. All right, what is the initial value and what does it represent? The initial value, again, we said it started off at 100, and that was the leftover money from last year's fundraiser. So $100 is our initial value, and that's the leftover money from last year's fundraiser. Okay, and E, use your answers to write an equation that shows the total amount of money the school will have, including the leftover money and the money earned selling X number of cards. Again, we already pretty much have this. So again, you need the slope-intercept form. So again, this is our slope Y-Intercept formula, which is, of course, y equals mx plus b. Well, we already found our m, which is our rate of change, which we now call our slope. So our m was 2, and our b, which is our y-intercept, which we used to call our initial value, was 100. So we can just go ahead and plug that into our formula. So y is going to equal our m, which was 2, plus our b, which was 100. Okay, and moving on. Find out more. The rate of change is also known as the slope of the graph. Go ahead and underline that or highlight it or something. So we've now learned that the rate of change is the same thing as the slope, which is the same thing as the ratio of rise over run. Okay, slope is equal to rise over run, which tells you how many units the line goes up for every unit that it goes over. In graph A, the line rises 1/2 unit for every 1 unit that it goes over. The slope describes the steepness of the line. That's very important. Okay, so if I'm looking and trying to figure out which graph A, B, or C, has the steepest slope, we would look at what the actual slope is for each, or we could just look at the graph, the line, and see, well, which one is more steep. The one that's the most steep is the one that has the greatest slope. Okay, you can find the slope using any 2 points on the line. That is so important. There's no special recipe that you have to follow. You just find 2 points that lie on your line and you use them in your slope formula. Okay, so right here, the rise or the vertical change over the run, which is the horizontal change, is the difference of the y values divided by the difference in the x values. This is our slope formula. y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. All right, use this formula with 2 points on graph C. So they chose the points 1, 2 and 2, 4. So point 2, they labeled as 2, 4, and point 1 was 1, 2. So then they just plugged it in and found that their slope was 2. The y-intercept is the y-coordinate for the point where the graph line intersects the y-axis. Again, we already knew this, but we used to call it the initial value. So initial value is now called the y-intercept. Okay? For the graphs above, the y-intercept is 0, and we know that because that's where all these lines began. They all began at 0, 0. All right? The graph on the previous page has a y-intercept of 100. You can use the slope and y-intercept to write an equation for any linear function. So literally all you need is a slope and y-intercept, and you can write that slope-intercept formula, which is why you can probably see why it's called the slope-intercept formula, because that's all you need is those two things. Okay, in the equation y equals mx plus b, m is the slope and b is the y-intercept. Of course, we've already talked about that, but in case you did not know, that's what it means. Because the y-intercepts in the graph above are all 0, the equations are y equals 1/2 x, y equals x, and y equals 2x. The reason they look like this is because, again, their y-intercepts were 0. So in the form of y equals mx plus b, they don't need the plus b, but we do know that if we wanted to write it in the slope-intercept formula way, then we could have just rewritten them as y equals 1/2 x plus 0. But if you're just adding 0, it doesn't change the value, so you don't have to put it that way. All right, and then finally, the reflect. What number will the x-coordinate always be in the ordered pair that identifies the y-intercept? So again, we're talking about the y-intercept, which is where the line intersects the y-axis. So if I'm looking at a graph and I have this line, And I say, and you know for a fact that the y-intercept is the y-coordinate for the point where the graphed line intercepts the y-axis. Well, the y-axis is here, and the x-axis is here. So where this line goes through the y-axis, and if you look at our x-axis, it's going to have to be when x equals 0, no matter what. So you're going to have 0, comma, whatever that number is, we'll just call it 2. And it doesn't matter what it is, your x has to be 0, because when the y-axis crosses, the y-axis meets the x-axis at 0. So if I'm finding the y-intercept, it has to be when my x equals 0. It'll be when x equals 0 because the x-axis for the ordered pair of any y-intercept is 0. For any ordered pair of any y-intercept will be 0, because if a point is on the y-axis, the x value will have to be 0, like we said. All right, and that is it for day 1 in our textbook. Please go ahead and practice what you've just learned in our workbook pages 91 and 92. You can input your answers into the form. Have a great day.